studying we're continuing the Gospel of Mark. We're in the second chapter. Last week, we looked at the famous story of Jesus healing a paralytic that was lowered through a roof on a mat. And this week, we're going to look at 4 stories. We want to remember that the Gospel of Mark is filled with many very short, brief, succinct stories. They just go one right after the other in such rapid succession that sometimes it's just easy to miss very important points in those. So again, what we're going to look at today has 4 stories. And the first one begins in verse 13, and it is the story of Jesus calling another one of his disciples. And it says, once again, Jesus went out beside the lake. What is the lake? Well, that's just another word or title for the Sea of Galilee. And it says that a large crowd came to him and he began to teach them. Now, it was very common practice in these days for rabbis, instead of just teaching in someone's house, always or only, or in the synagogue, to just take their disciples and go for a walk. And they would use the common everyday illustrations of life. Remember, Jesus talked about the flowers of the field and the birds of the air and the foxes who have dens, but he had no place. And so it was an opportunity to use those common experiences as teaching opportunities. And it was also an opportunity for the rabbi to get a little public exposure. As he's walking through the village, stopping at the market, whatever, people would notice which rabbi had the largest number of followers. So in verse 14, it says, as he walked along, he saw Levi, son of Alphaeus, sitting at the tax collector's booth. Follow me, Jesus told him, and Levi got up and followed him. Levi. Now, who is this guy? And I bring that up because if you look in the Gospels of Matthew and Luke, this person is called Matthew. Maybe this is another disciple that we just kind of lost track of. What's the explanation here? So it's very common in Jesus's day for a Jewish man to have both a Hebrew name and a Greek name. Remember, the Greeks came before the Romans, and the Greeks had so influenced Palestine that it became common for a man to have both names. And that's why we have Paul and Saul, and Simon and Peter, Thomas, Didymus, etc. And it says that Matthew was sitting at a tax collector's booth, but because of the location, we think that Matthew was probably more of a toll collector than a tax collector. And here's the reason why. Palestine was a land bridge between Europe and Africa. When you think of Europe, think of Greece and Italy. When you think of Africa, think of Egypt. And so the land bridge or the land highway went through Palestine. And the first major city you had to go through either way was Capernaum. And that's where you had to pay your import and export taxes. So if that's accurate, it means that Matthew was more of a toll collector than a tax collector. And that means he didn't work for the Romans, but he worked for Herod. But regardless, he collected taxes. And in those days, and I think you all know this, a tax collector was a little bit beyond despised. They were hated. I really don't know who to compare them to in today's world. Did I hear a suggestion in the background?
IRS agents.
Amen.
What was it?
I think it might not have changed since then. People feel the same about tax collectors.
Oh, okay. Oh, goodness. I remember in the first church I pastored, I had a member who worked for the IRS. He just dreaded telling people who he worked for. He would just say, I work for the government, or, he'd have different words for it. But he told people he worked for the IRS, people would they grab their pocketbook or their purse, I felt so sorry for Danny about that. But the tax collectors in those days, you know how that process worked. Rome said, or Herod said, okay, once a year, I'm coming to you and you're going to give me X amount of dollars. I don't care how you collect it, but I'm taking it from you, or you don't want to know what the other alternative would be. So the tax collectors then would get that money and they would get more. They could collect all they want. They could do it by hook or by crook. And so the poor common people had no idea what the taxes would be from year to year. And so they just, again, hated and despised tax collectors. I'm sure they just prayed that God's judgment would come upon them any day. So keep that in mind now as we get to the second story, which begins in verse 15. It says, while Jesus was having dinner at Levi's house, remember Levi's is Matthew, many tax collectors and sinners, two different groups, tax collectors and sinners, were eating with him and his disciples, for there were many who followed him. Many tax collectors. So it seems that Matthew's first reaction after accepting Jesus's call to follow him is to go get his friends. And so he has this big party, this big banquet, and he invites his friends. Now, Matthew would have had very few friends, and they would have all been from his little circle of friends. So you have this house packed with people from that world, that inner world of corruption and greed. Again, I don't know what to compare this to other than, is it like the mafia? Is it like the drug cartel? Who would it be like today? And then there are the sinners, and the word sinner has a double significance. While it didn't mean a person who broke the moral law, it also meant a person who did not observe the scribal laws. Remember, there's over 600 of those. So in the eyes of the Orthodox Jew, the man who murdered and the man who did not correctly wash his hands before a meal were equal sinners. Now, the Jews had a phrase for people who did not keep the law, these sinners that we're talking about. They were called the people of the land. Let me read you a quote. They were the common rabble who did not observe all the religious rules and regulations of a conventional Pharisaic piety. The Orthodox Jewish persons were forbidden to have anything to do with them. They could not even talk to them. For a person to marry one meant that person was considered dead and treated as so. So Jesus is again making a statement. You have the wrong understanding of God. God loves all people. So you have these tax collectors and you have these sinners. And so I have just a couple thoughts I want to throw out there. Did the tax collectors and the sinners even associate with one another? Did one of those groups think they were a little better than the other? Sometimes, I'm sure none of us do this, but we tend to think that one sin is worse than the other. You remember the Pharisees did that. They put all sins into two groups. They had the sins of disposition. This is just my character. This is my nature. I have a bad temper, but I get over it very quickly. Then they had the sins of passion, murder, adultery. And so all sins came under one of those two categories. And the Pharisees tended to be a lot more tolerant of those sins of disposition because they could justify them in their own mind. And so you have these tax collectors in the house and you have these sinners. And I'm wondering if they're on different ends of the living room, all clumped together, looking at one another and saying, well, at least I'm not like those folks. All right. And then you have a third group there. It says his disciples. Now, my imagination just kind of runs wild here, but I can just picture these poor disciples, or at least I can imagine myself in that situation. They've only been walking with their rabbi. And at this point, he's still just a rabbi. Nobody has proclaimed him as Lord or Savior. And so they've just been with him for a short time, and they've seen his authority over sickness and disease and in so many other ways. And their mind just has to be spinning. What is going to happen next? And we're going to eat supper with who? You're going to put us in the same room with these tax collectors? These are the people who've been keeping food off my table, Jesus. These are the people who make me work long hours and make me struggle to pay my bills and to keep a roof over my head for my kids. I don't like these folks. In fact, Jesus, if I was going to be honest with you, I wish they were dead. And so now you want me to hang out with these people and these sinners? You know, that's just the common folk. That's a trailer trash, Jesus. You know, I'm a middle-class, hardworking person here. And you want me to associate, have a meal with someone means that you associated with them, you accepted them, you saw them as a friend on both a social level and a religious level. So these poor disciples, as we read any of the Gospels, we see that they were just always one page behind Jesus. They were always struggling to try to catch up with what he was trying to teach them and how they were to understand him. So picture that. You got these tax collectors, you got the sinners, and then you've got these disciples. And they're all crammed together. And I'm sure they're all uncomfortable. And here's Jesus, just as happy and as relaxed and as loving as he always is. Now, verse 16 says, wait a minute. Here comes the fourth group. When the teachers of the law who were Pharisees saw him eating with the sinners and tax collectors, they asked his disciples, why does he eat with tax collectors and sinners? Why does he associate with them? Do you not understand what your rabbi is doing? If he's eating with them, that means he's one of their friends, and he loves them and considers them equal in the eyes of God as far as their humanity. So where do these teachers of the law come from? I really doubt that Matthew invited them. Did they crash the party? Well, the odds are this is an outside meal. We know that Matthew must have had a lot of money. And so homes, or families that were affluent had courtyards. Sometimes there were little brick walls around them. Somewhere they were not. They would have trees planted in them. The stove would be outside so that, to get rid of the heat. And so it was very common that when there was a big party in town, everybody else in that little village would come stand around and listen to all the conversations. I mean, the people were outside. You couldn't help but know what was going on. And so that's probably what has happened. You remember these teachers of the law felt like part of their responsibility was to preserve orthodoxy. And part of their responsibility was to expose a false prophet. And so they are always right on Jesus's heels, looking for him to make a mistake. And so that's why they have showed up. So you've got those four groups now. And they ask that question of Jesus. I'm sorry, actually, they ask his disciples. They don't ask Jesus. You remember the story right before this, when Jesus, it says, knowing what was in their heart, reprimanded them. You remember, they were thinking to themselves, why does this man think he has the authority to forgive sins? And Jesus corrected them. So I'm sure they're still kind of smarting from that. So they're talking to the disciples and trying to avoid Jesus. But on hearing this, Jesus said to them, it is not the healthy who need a doctor, but the sick. I have not come to call the righteous, but sinners. I have not come to call the righteous, but sinners. Now, this sounds at first as if Jesus has no need for good people, but that can't be it. But Bill, tell me your thoughts about this.
Well, of course, Ricky's giving me the tough job here. Current situation during this period of time. Now, I want to go behind the background to the background behind the background. It's important for us to know this because, as you all know, the basic question that Jesus faced in his time of civilization was the same one that we face today. And that is the question of how do you get along? How do you view people and how do you treat people? This is a very critical question that some of us won't like Jesus' answer. Jesus came from heaven to earth at a time that was a crossroads in all of civilization, ever since man and women were created. Because Jesus came to a time where nearly every civilization had a 10 commandments. If you look back in history, you know, I taught world religions and I studied this a long time to find out that it's not surprising that all of the world religions and civilizations had what we and I think of as a 10 commandments. That is, they had these basic rules. You know, don't murder people, don't mess around with somebody's family, be truthful, don't steal, and so forth. But then came the rub. Every civilization, of course, these laws were given to say, how can you build a good civilization? How can you get along? We know this, that it's easy to say, here are the 10 basic guidelines or laws or commandments. But the big rub comes at, but how do you treat these people when they break it? Because as we know, the Bible teaches us later in the times of Jesus and Paul, everybody breaks them. So what do you do with them? What do you do with people that break the 10 commandments? That's you and me and everybody else. This lesson that Jesus teaching here is critical, is a foundational teaching for all of Jesus' teaching. He put it down early in his ministry, with Mark being the first of the gospel, and it's repeated so often. It's a basic question of when you start adding up your practical laws of how you're going to deal with people who break the commandments, or people you don't like, or people who just are bad acting people who behave terribly. What are you going to do with them? How are you going to look at them when somebody comes to you? What are you going to do? Are you going to say, oh, I'm better than these folks? Well, what else are you going to do with them? And as we look back, the basic civilizations, like the Hebrews, some of us believe the Hebrews had the earliest of all civilizations. Others who basically are people who have looked at history from a historical perspective, not biblical perspective. Look at the Mesopotamians, you know, with Hammurabi and his code. He had his 10 commandments and he had his rules of how do you carry out those 10 commandments. And you had the Egyptians, you had the Chinese, you had of course, the Incas and the people down in South America and Central America. You've all seen stories about the Mayans and all these others. Well, let me just tell you, one thing they had in common, they had their ways of dealing with people. And basically it was, you deal with people according to how they do. If someone is bad, you treat them badly. If someone's good, you treat them nicely. If someone does something that's as bad as stealing, you cut their hand off. If someone bites you, you knock a teeth out, you got to knock their teeth out. If someone looks at somebody in the way they're not supposed to, you pluck their eye out. In other words, the basic rule was you don't treat, why did they have these laws? They wanted to not have excesses in their minds. That is, somebody who steals an apple should not be punished the same way that somebody that steals a man's wife. They said they're different rules according to, and so they set up all these rules like Ricky referred to. Even the Jews did. They set up these rules to say, let's treat people according to how they act. And so even in Exodus, you know, sounds very much like the Hammurabi Code, the eye for an eye and tooth for a tooth. Did you notice in Exodus, I have it right here before me, in Exodus 21, 23, 24, it says, you must punish a person to match the injury. And it goes on to say in verse 24, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. a hand for a hand. In the early Jewish rules, it spelled out this basic animal way of dealing with it is no, you don't cut someone's hand off because because they tell a lie and it didn't hurt a whole lot of people. Maybe you just wash their mouth out. But it goes on to say, if you do something as bad as we think it's bad, then they must get the equal punishment. This was a law called the law of retaliation, the law of karma. Some of you know it, the law of exact or equal retaliation. So all of these laws were designed to keep people from over punishing. But let's face it, it all watered down to the same thing. It watered down that you treat people according to what they have treated others. Well, I believe we've got some Christians that way today, don't you? We got folks who say, okay, if you do something bad, then we ought to punish you in the same way. If you have gone out and done something really terrible, we're going to really punish you. If you've done something that's not too bad, then we won't punish you that bad. So the ancient law and the modern law has very much in common. In civilizations, I won't be able to take time to do it, but I wanted to say this because Jesus walked into a world where the golden rule of dealing with people and looking at people was to treat people the way they treat you. That was the golden rule, Hammurabi, the golden rule of all civilizations, the Greeks, the Romans, and all of that. That was the basis behind all of their laws. But then Jesus came along and he got in big time trouble because Jesus said, no, you do not treat people according to how they've treated you. Jesus said the golden rule is that you do unto others how you would want them to do unto you. He said, this is God's way. And so what Jesus did here, if you look at this, Jesus broke a huge, significant way of living. He broke the early Judaistic laws more important than people. And I have to say, to this very day, in all of my ministry, I found people who look back in the Old Testament and find words like this, an eye for an eye and a hand for an hand and tooth for tooth. And they say, you Christians are no different than the rest of these people. So we got folks who will say, well, the Old Testament's old hats. Let's look at the New Testament. Well, that's one way of getting around. We'll talk about that some other time. But the fact of it is, religion based on this kind of retaliation was not the way of Jesus. When Jesus came along, as you see in this story, this is where Jesus very early on, as Ricky just pointed out, Jesus said, this is not right. We're going to make a big change, my followers. Jesus basically was saying, here's a guy, Matthew, who is a tax collector. Tax collectors in those days, as Ricky was pointing out, were not only considered bad people, they were the absolute worst. Why? A tax collector was joining forces with Rome. They were, I would say, the equivalent of a tax collector today was a traitor, a person who was caring more about making money and going along with the enemy than he was his own family, his own faith, his own community. He was a traitor. And you can imagine today, what do we do with traitors? Traitors can be in some places killed, or at least almost killed. And so if you look at anything, I don't care whether it's a kidnapper or it's a molester or it's a trafficker, I think we'd have to say, Jesus is pointing this person out, Matthew, as an example. How are you going to look at people? Are you going to look at them like the Hammurabi Code did? Are you going to look at them, all these religions around us, all the civilizations around us? Are you going to look at them that way? Are you going to look at them like I do, like God the Father does? So this is very important. And I don't have time to go into all of it, but here's what Jesus said. He said, look, healthy people don't need a doctor. Sick people do. And I came, as he says, I came to call those, not those who think they're righteous, they're good, they're right, I came to those who know they're sinners. They've missed the mark. The word sinners, hamartia in Greek, hamartia in Greek means missing the mark. People who know they've missed the mark. That's who I've come for. And here, I'm going to just give 3 principles, Ricky. Here they are. 1, Jesus always was spiritually sensitive. He looked at people, first of all, and didn't just see their physical fault they'd done. He saw their eternal destiny. These years on planet Earth were just a short term. He wanted everybody to be in heaven. And he looked at people and said, what can I do to help them? Secondly, he said that he came to call those who knew they needed help. He was always merciful, always encouraging. He's saying, no matter if you are a traitor, you are the worst of the worst. I'll tell you how I'm going to look at you. I'm going to look at you, a person who is sick. How do you look at people? Sick or bad? I know it's a tendency to take the old way, but Jesus' way is to say, this is somebody sick who needs healing. Doctors don't look at patients as being bad. Doctors look at patients as sick people who need help. I don't know anything about their background. I don't know anything about their morality. What I do know is they need help. The third thing, Jesus was always sympathetic, but he was protective. That is, Jesus cared. And he said in one place in the Bible, it says, Jesus viewed all people as people who needed mercy. The Bible says this, the Father will order his angels to protect and to guard you. Jesus saw himself as a shepherd, and he saw these people as sheep who'd gone far astray, but they were people who needed to come back. But at the same time, they had to be protected. We need to see people, no matter how bad they are, they need mercy, but we need to protect the family. We need to protect the community. We need to protect the church to make sure they won't hurt our children, hurt our community, hurt those closest to them. In other words, he's saying, yes, we need to be merciful, but we need to protect the family of God. So Jesus had this revolutionary breakthrough that he was teaching. I think that was a fundamental teaching of God's mercy. And Ricky, that's about the best thing I can think of as this.
Wow, Bill, that was excellent. Excellent. My goodness, that was about half of a seminary year there in about 10 minutes. Thank you. That was wonderful. Maybe we should just close up and go home. What do y'all think? That was great.
I think
Let's move on to verse 18. This is the third story in the passage we're going to look at today. And here that Jesus is going to be questioned about fasting.
Before we go on, can we talk about this just a little bit further before we go on?
Sure.
Okay.
Okay, so this depiction is all of the people who follow Christ. When it refers to the large crowd, and these are some of the groups that gather in that large crowd to follow. Now, in this passage, they refer to eating. This one's eating, and they're eating again, and they're eating again. And the Pharisees are wondering why Jesus is breaking bread. Now, the bread that he's breaking is the gospel. So why isn't Jesus coming to us, the people who know the gospel, and preaching and teaching with us? And then he says, those that already think that they're righteous don't need the Savior. It's only those who are sick. So this whole depiction is about the breaking of bread, the bread of life.
I don't think so. I respect your interpretation. I respect your view, but Ricky, I'll let you take it. But I just want to say one thing, because it kind of does not fit the historical background. The historical background is that the eating is not the gospel, and it's not what you're saying. I think that's one view, but my view is that the eating was just what Ricky said. It's a sign that Jesus was showing fellowship, just like when I go to a bunch of drunks and a bunch of idiots who are trying to just live it up, and I go and I become friends with them, and I sit down and I eat his meal with them. I'm not breaking the gospel. What I'm doing is I'm showing that I care about you, and then when I care about you, it opens a door for them to listen to me. I think that's what that's all about. Ricky, what do you think?
Well, Kathy,
Before we go on
here
to
you-
Ricky, Bill, I don't think it's appropriate to just shut Kathy down that way.
No, I don't think it's shutting her
You
down. I
should
think that's
apologize to her.
well, Tom, I think everybody's entitled to their opinion, and I don't think Bill's trying to be critical. I just think he's just trying to be honest and sharing. So
Well,
let,
it doesn't have to be in a hurtful way.
Well, if I sound critical, forgive me, Kathy. I'm trying to say, Kathy, I think what you're saying is that from a Christian standpoint, you might interpret it that way. But I think from a Jewish standpoint, this was written, it was just showing that Jesus was a different sort of fellow.
Well, the subject matter is the spiritual depiction. See, and that, when you look at that perspective, a lot is going on that's not visibly spoken, because he used these parables and it's kind of the eye of the beholder. You see, so I have a different perspective with the meals that are shared, because I have been a witness myself with the word, and the word is powerful. And so the power given to us to spread the gospel is another way of breaking bread with our neighbor. I mean, in the account right before this, where the neighbors came and Ralph sent the link for us all to watch the depiction. There's a lot going on there. Like, one of the disciples crawled up onto the roof to see from that perspective, and Mary was already on the roof. So the opening that they made was like a symbolic expression of the heart being softened so that their friend could get close to Jesus. We do this in expressions like Emmaus. When we invite our friends to Emmaus and they experience this wonderful weekend, there's a lot of spiritual enlightenment that goes on.
Well, thank you, Kathy. I appreciate that insight. I wonder if there's anybody else has some ideas.
I don't see any hands up, so
Well, I was gonna say, I think that one of the things that I enjoyed most about this Bible study that I did recently was the teacher was able to, her specialty was first century living, how everything was happening, and what things meant at that time. And so we called it looking through a Mediterranean lens, because that's kind of the way it was going, versus looking through a Christian lens and an American lens, because we've got the ability now, as Kathy said, we're looking at it from a different point of view than a historical point of view. And that's what I find very interesting, is that we're able to hear both. And I'm not trying to just be a mediator, but without understanding how things were in the first century, we can't extrapolate to what Kathy is saying, to look at it from a spiritual point of view. They were looking at it they were in it. And that's what Bill was talking about. They're in it and they don't know the spiritual part yet. We're able to look at it, thank God, because I would have missed so much living in the moment. I miss a lot now living in the moment. So we have to have both, I think. But without knowing the first century or the perspective or how it felt living in those times, we miss a lot. So I, for one, would like to continue to hear both, like what Bill was saying and what Kathy was saying. That helps me really find my perspective.
Okay, anyone else?
I think we're good, Ricky, go ahead.
All right, let's go to verse 18 then. This is again, this is that third story in this passage, and it'll be Jesus being questioned about fasting. It says, now John's disciples and the Pharisees were fasting. So there's two groups that are fasting. John's disciples are still around. We can only assume that John is still alive. He's not yet been beheaded. He has taught his disciples to fast. We don't know what they're fasting from or for how long. And then it says that the Pharisees were fasting. Now, history tells us that the Pharisees fasted on, where did I put this down? Every Monday and Thursday from 6 a.m. to 6 a.m. to 6 p.m. And we also know that it was their custom to whiten their faces with makeup. They would wear crumpled clothing. And when they were in public, their faces, they would make faces of anguish and grief. They want to make sure people knew that they were fasting. And Jesus would criticize them about that later. Now, the Jews as a whole were expected to fast one day every year. That was the Day of Atonement. They're still expected to do that. They would fast from 6 a.m. again to 6 p.m. And also the New Testament church, beginning about the end of the first century and toward the beginning of the second century, they began to teach fasting on Fridays, and from 6 a.m. to 6 p.m. And that's why the Catholic Church still has that practice today. So verse 19 then, Jesus answered, how can the guest of the bridegroom fast while he is with them? They cannot, so long as they have them with him. So here we see that Jesus compares himself to a bridegroom. Now, there's a lot of metaphors he could have chosen. Why did he do that? Well, because the Old Testament taught that God's salvation could be compared to a wedding feast in which God marries Israel. And later, the New Testament would teach the marriage or wedding metaphor to be a relationship between Christ and the church. So for Jesus to claim to be the bridegroom is saying that he is God, God incarnate, the promised Messiah. Now, you have to wonder at this point, who got it? Who understood that? And then it also says they cannot, so long as they have him with them. So long as, it means that Jesus is foretelling his departure. He is telling them about his death. And as we go on through the book of Mark, we're going to see that Jesus repeatedly tells his disciples he has to go to Jerusalem, he has to suffer, and he has to die. And they either just didn't get it or they didn't want to hear it. But he repeatedly told him that. It means that Jesus always had the cross before him. He understood, even before he launched his ministry, where this was going. He would end up in Jerusalem. He'd be rejected by his own people. And yet he never turned away. We always want to remember the humanity of Jesus. Jesus could have rejected that calling. Jesus could have turned away from the cross. But yet he was obedient, as the book of Hebrews tells us, obedient unto death. Now, verse 20 says, but the time will come when the bridegroom will be taken from them, and on that day they will fast. The time will come. Jesus is again foretelling his suffering and crucifixion. Jesus was very aware of that. I know that some people teach that the cross was God's plan B, that originally God had hoped that the Jewish people would recognize Jesus as the Messiah, and then the kingdom of God would come, but they didn't. So God then had to come up with another plan, kind of off the cuff. But Jesus saw the cross from the beginning and never turned away from it. And on that day, I'm sorry, I lost my notes here. And on that day, from the time of Jesus' ascension until the time of his return, we are to fast as he directs us. Jesus was saying, the bridegroom is with the disciples, then there's no need to fast. But from his ascension on till the time he returns, we are to fast as he directs us. And then when he returns, we will have what Revelation chapter 19 refers to as the marriage supper of the Lamb. There again, it is that metaphor. So now we move on to the fourth story. And it's very interesting. Now, I hope I can explain this correctly. It says, well, let me just throw this in before we, just to preface the scripture. Jesus will now suddenly jump from talking about fasting to talking about unshrunk patches of garment and old wineskins. Now, that's quite a leap. Why did he do that? I think it's because the teachers of the law and the Pharisees have not understood these three other situations. They've not understood why he called Matthew, why he called someone that nobody else wanted. And they have not understood why he associated with social outcasts, those sinners. They just don't get that. And they have not understood why his disciples do not fast. They do not understand that he is the bridegroom. That means they do not understand who he is or fully understand God. Therefore, it means their minds are closed to the full truth about God. So he uses two illustrations to show how necessary it is to have an open mind. So here we go with those last two stories. Verse 21, Jesus said, "No one sews a patch of unshrunk cloth to an old garment." Now, you probably all know this, but back in Jesus's day, remember, 95% of the people lived in poverty. Today, we'd say they live below the poverty line. If we have clothing that tears, we throw it away, we give it to Goodwill, we go buy something new. Back then, they couldn't afford to do that. They had to know how to patch all torn garments. And if you had, if you're going to use a patch that had not been wetted and then allowed to shrink, then when you sewed it around that hole, as it began then to shrink, it would tear away and it would make the hole even worse. That's why it was very common for women to always have patches of different sizes that they'd already wetted and allowed to shrink. So notice here that it says, making the tear worse. Notice Jesus is teaching his concern for the preservation of the old garment, keeping it from being torn and made worse. So see, Jesus is offering a new understanding of God. That's the heart of Jesus's ministry. And that's why people were afraid of him. And that's why people hated him. And that's ultimately why the religious people would have him crucified. He was teaching a new understanding. But even though he had that new understanding, he did not want to throw away the old. We must remember that Jesus never stopped being a Jew. But he did try to give Judaism a new understanding of God. Remember, he said, it's now written in Matthew 5:17, "Do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets." Remember, the law was the law of Moses. The prophets, that was a catch-all phrase for all the teachings of the prophet. Those two together was the heart of Judaism. That was the heart of the teaching of the Jewish religion. Do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. Now, the word fulfill means to bring to completion. That's what Jesus was trying to do, was tell the people of his day, you have not fully understood God. I want to bring that understanding of God to completion. I want you to have a full understanding of God, but your mind has to be open. You have to be willing to be taught. You have to be willing to change your ideas. Are you willing to open your mind? That's a challenge even for us today. So then Jesus now is going to make sure he drives that point home, and he reinforces it with a second illustration we find in verse 22. And no one puts new wine into old wineskins. Otherwise, the wine will burst the skins, and both the wine and the wineskins will be ruined. No, they pour new wine into new wineskins. So back in this day, every Jewish family had their own vineyard. They made their own wine. Their wine was diluted with water. It was not really similar to our wine today, but as they made this wine and they would put it into wine skins, of course, wine, as it ferments, forms a gas. Gas needs to expand. You wanted to put it in a wine skin that didn't have bottles or big wooden barrels. So you needed a skin that would stretch. It'd be elastic. The old wineskins were dry and brittle. They could no longer stretch. And then the new wineskin would cause it to rupture. The old wineskins couldn't contain the new wine. Jesus is saying here, his teachings, his way of understanding God, of fully understanding God, that's the new wine. The old wineskins, that's like our mind. Sometimes our minds can get to the place where we're no longer open to what God is telling us. We're no longer elastic. We're no longer ready to stretch and hear what God is telling us. Maybe it's God telling us, I want you to stop doing something, whatever it is, you fill in the blank here. And maybe God has told us that for years, and we've just kind of learned to tune that out. Maybe God's telling us, I want you to begin this new thing, this good thing. Maybe God is challenging us to see a relationship reconcile. Maybe God is saying, hey, you need to ask someone for forgiveness. Is your mind open? Is it willing to stretch, to fully understand God? That was a challenge that Jesus presented the people of his day. Many of them did not accept that. His disciples were willing to do that. And that's the challenge